Welcome to the Yellow Brick Therapy Podcast, episode number 10. I had the pleasure of interviewing Lisa Butler, who's been a therapist since 2008 and has worked in both private practice and is now working at Catholic Charities in downtown. She is duly licensed in the state of Kansas as both a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist and also a licensed clinical addiction counselor. We talked about so many amazing things during this podcast: perfectionism, our own journey with that, an expanded definition of addiction, and I am so excited to share this with you guys. So let's go ahead and tune in. All right, so we're going to start off with the first four. What did you want to be when you grew up?
So probably from the earliest ages, what I always knew, when you think about what are you going to be, what are you going to do, I was going to be a wife and a mom. I came from a big family, and just that was, I don't know, that was what I knew, that was what I felt in my, from my depths, that was what I was supposed to do. Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted. That's what that mattered more than anything else.
Yes, and you are a wife and mom now, correct?
Yeah. So my husband and I have been married, 14 years, and we've got 3 kiddos. Wow. The girls are both in middle school, so they're 13 and almost 12, and then my little man is 5.
Aw, that's awesome. So 2 girls and a little boy, so you definitely... That's neat that you're able to be I got to do the thing that I knew that I wanted to do and be. And so how did that lead you into, becoming a marriage and family therapist?
Well, obviously you graduate high school and you're like, okay, well, my goal is to be a wife and mother. Mm-hmm. I can't just sit around. I'm gonna, go to college, experience life, and I'm thrifty enough that I wasn't going to just waste money in school. So if I was going to go to school, I was going to do something that I knew would benefit me no matter what. Mm-hmm. So, and those early psych classes kind of just intrigued my interest and realized, okay, well, understanding people, understanding how families work, understanding myself is going to benefit me no matter what. And then I had heard, because I went to Newman, right across the street was the MFT program at Friends, was just kind of getting started at that point, I think, or it hadn't been around very many years. And so that was kind of even from the beginning, before I really knew what my undergrad major was going to be, I had an idea of a master's degree. So in a way, I kind of worked backwards of going, okay, if I'm going to do that for a master's, what's the best undergrad to do that? And I ended up at K-State, mm-hmm. After a series of events, ended up at K-State in family studies and human services.
And that's directly, we were talking about this earlier, but that's directly a route into MFT is what you said.
Oh,
or
yes.
Felt like that.
Yeah, it very much did, because we had all the same professors as the MFT program, and many of our, more of those entry-level classes were taught by the MFT graduate students. Mm-hmm. So as they were learning, they were teaching us, and I even got to help with some of their research as part of an honors program that I was a part of there.
Cool, that's awesome. So you really got to delve into it a little bit before even getting into a master's program, and you kind of you've already had a taste of it, and the seeds were planted for you, so that just kind of
sure
gracefully led into it. It sounds like
actually it really helped me when I came to Friends, that I had family systems thinking for a couple of years by then.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, because I will say, at least in my experience, I had a psychology undergraduate degree, and I knew that I was really interested in interpersonal studies and family systems, but I wouldn't say that I had the systemic lens until I really went into grad school. And so that's neat that you were able to have that in your undergraduate experience. So.
Yeah, I don't think we knew how lucky we were, but
yeah,
it was very good.
That's awesome. And tell me, kind of diving into getting to know you a little bit more as a therapist, tell me more about what I call your worst or one of your most learning experiences in therapy.
I'm gonna go right to the depth of it.
Right into it.
In thinking about that, I don't know that any one particular memory really comes to mind, but we know as MFTs, I mean, we're trained for that interventive moment, and we're trained, to get that good rapport and that and to join first, because people can't go there with you. They won't go there with you if they don't have that trust for you and that relationship with you. And I think the worst or the most humbling moments are when you think you've got that and they're not ready. Or they're not ready to do it with you. I mean, either you have to be ready, willing, and able. We were taught that in school, but I think those humbling moments are when I thought we were ready, and that we could kind of take that leap, and either they weren't able to go there with me, or they weren't able to go there at all.
Right. And that's such a good point, because I think as therapists, we can have these great ideas about where we want to go and what they need in their life, and if only they did this, and then if we're letting that lead our session versus really building that relationship and being in that moment with them where they're at and meeting them, we miss the whole thing, and we're trying to push our own agendas. And so, I love that. You're right. As MFTs, we're taught that self as a therapist to really, kind of stand back and meet people where they are.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. So we'll kind of flip the script a little bit. What would be a moment in therapy that was a really good moment for you, or something that you feel like was maybe even like one of those teaching aha moments where you did something and you're like, yes, that was important work that I just did, and I just learned something about, this work.
Yeah. When I think about kind of like those, maybe the opposite, or those best moments, I mean, obviously we all love it when you're ready to graduate, they're successfully terminating. I always thought that was an interesting, the word choice. I'm like, I use graduate. Successfully terminate just sounds like, I don't know, I'm not executing anybody here.
Right.
But I had a moment recently when I'd been working with an adolescent girl for quite a while, and we were getting close to graduation, and she was definitely ready. She felt like she'd accomplished her goals. Mom was a little more tentative. I was trying to honor where each of them were at, but there was this moment in session where she basically is telling her mother what therapy is. And mocking me as she does it, in a way that only a adolescent girl can do. Yes. But she's telling her mom, well, this is what therapy is. She's like, and she's pretending to be me and sits up in her chair and she says, you have to love, the goal of life is to love yourself and others. But to love others, you got to love yourself first. And if you don't, then this is what we're going to do about it. And she's just kind of, but it was just this cute moment of going, okay, she doesn't need me. She's got that script in her head of what she needs to do. And it was just kind of a beautiful thing of having her, because I love the narrative work, and having her repeat that story. And I kind of retyped out a quote. And while I had something pulled up on my computer, so it was kind of this mountain in the background. And then I typed her quote and with her name and age on it, and printed out and gave it and sent it home with her, of just going, these are your words. You don't need my words. These are your words and your story and where you're going from here. And if you guys need me, you'll come back. And if you don't, I wish you well. But I don't know. I've learned there's so many different moments over the years of clients really just teaching me and educating me about their life. Right. And in being curious and always being the student, God, you just learn so much more than when you think you got to be the knower.
Yes. Yep. When your ego's in check.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. No, that totally makes a lot of sense to me. That's really neat. I've never sent like a quote home with a client, but to put their own words and to kind of create that memento is memento the right word? Memento for them is just, that's beautiful. Like I hear different like ways that therapists do that, and I'm always like, oh, that's a good idea for me to put in my back pocket for another time.
Just kind of happened because I'd typed some other inspirational quote out on this mountain scene, and I still had it I knew I had that where I could access it quickly, and so I just popped over to my computer and changed the words and, save as, whatever. Mm-hmm. And she was just, I don't know. I think she was really, it was a good moment for her to go, Mom, look, these are my words. Yeah. I'm okay. I am ready.
Wow. And just that validation to her and like to see it, Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. So we're going to get a little silly now as I am curious as to what your spirit animal is.
I was thinking about that because, I don't know. I suppose it's much like your favorite color when you're a kid. It might change over time. Mm-hmm. But if I've got to pick one now, I would say it has kind of, at least maybe the last decade of my life, it's probably been a tigress.
A tigress?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Well, I was probably very different than I am now. As a kid, I was pretty shy, pretty timid, sassy in my own right, but usually just in my own head. Nobody got to hear those comments except for me, or maybe people that I was really close to. But it was just kind of growing through and pushing through some of that toxic anxiety to real growth. And I don't know, I've through my own therapeutic work, latched on to that image of a tiger. And, feeling, they're often solitary. They're often alone, other than when they're having cubs or whatever. But it's this idea that, and big cats, to a lot of Native American traditions, big cats are a leader. Mm-hmm. And leadership's always a little bit lonely. But it doesn't have to be lonely, right? So there's like solitude, and there's finding that combination between connection and then that, that playfulness, but that kind of that fierce strength as well. And there's probably a much longer story to it, but I actually ended up, after doing some of my own work, getting a tattoo as a therapeutic anchor, and I ended up with an orange tiger. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Do you mind sharing where it is? Or?
So it's on my core, because, I'm, like I said, it was a therapeutic anchor, so there was deep meaning about being on my core and being on the left, which is often considered the feminine side, and the movement, and I don't know.
That's so cool. That's neat. Yeah, I know a lot of people use, like, they do have their own therapeutic anchors, and they've used tattoo and art as that expression, and it's been something I've thought about and haven't really pulled the trigger on, but I definitely think at some point I probably will once I gather the courage. But yeah, I think it's beautiful to hear people's story and to put that in a artistic way.
And that's the funniest thing about it is I had done some work and was at some trainings and was talking about it and more joking about it, and so as I'm joking, I allow myself to be creative and come up with all these reasons and what and how and what, if I ever got one, which I wasn't going to. But I come home to my husband and tell him about it, and he was like, "Oh, that's hot." And I'm like, "I'm not actually going to do it," and then it as I continued to do my own therapy, it progressed from there, and I decided to get it.
That's neat. That's cool. That's cool that it wasn't really expected, but
no.
Here you are.
Oh no, not at all.
That's really neat. Well, we're going to go more into the meat of the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is kind of just an expansion on addictive behaviors, compulsions, shame resilience, all of that stuff, because they're very much intertwined. And so the first question that I had for you is, tell me more about your expanded definition of addiction. Because I know often when people think addiction, they immediately, well, they typically think of like drugs and alcohol and that sort of thing. So tell me more about that expanded definition.
Sure. So obviously I was trained as an MFT first and practiced for several years. It was more of a kind of where I was working at the time and a leadership request that I pursue the LCAC so I could help supervise that department. And it was kind of a little bit begrudging in the first, like, okay, I'll do it because you want me to. But the more I got into it, the more, and I actually got into working with the clients and helping with some of the groups and kind of filling in with other things or supervising the staff and processing cases, the more I was like, these are the same people. People are people are people. And I just began to really see, although sometimes it's easy for society and unfortunately even us as therapists to be a little judgy about addictions, to realize, that the little girl who stumbles upon cutting or burning really isn't any different from the little girl who stumbles upon smoking or drinking.
Right.
It's the same often traumatized story. And so the more that I really got into the work and met the clients, the more that I realized how wrong I had been before and how wrong so many of us, I think, are, and began to just kind of have this bigger picture of, okay, well, maybe I didn't drink, but I was, overachiever perfectionist in school, or I was, incredibly hard on myself, or, they took that substance, versus the person who's comforting with sugar and and pop and soda. Yes, one is addictive, one is not, but there's a lot of health problems with both. And it's, it's just kind of realizing, at least for me, I began to see addiction as any substance or behavior that we were using compulsively to not feel our pain. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the obvious ones, the illegal ones, but beyond that, when you really see what's the motivation for the behavior or whatever the substance is they're using, it could be anything from food to relationships to sex to being perfect to being a workaholic to really anything.
Yeah. I think the workaholism one can be really tough in our particular culture here in the U.S. because it's glorified. Mm-hmm. Workaholism is glorified, and a lot of people don't realize they are numbing pain and trauma and things with their behaviors because we don't call them addictions or problems,
Right, until it is. Until it's, that workaholic is avoiding their home life and their family is falling apart. Then we realize it's a problem, but we may still not call it what it is unless they're ready to do that. Yeah.
And it's tough because I could see how, what I've observed working with families and seeing different parts of addictions and people numbing things is it's normalized, like the dysfunction is normalized until you're right, like until something devastating happens. And if something devastating doesn't happen, like it just kind of keeps going and they kind of keep living in that family system of dysfunction, knowing that there's probably like kind of having that sense that something's a little off, but not really quite knowing what it is, right? Or maybe even not knowing and just being like, I thought it was normal to have this kind of relationship and these feelings and, continuing that cycle until somebody does have. I've seen workaholism, be passed down, and then, the next generation is they struggle with substances, right? And I'm sure you've seen that a lot in your work too.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. Or even with one person who and we kind of spoke a little bit about this earlier, but, they may struggle with one area and then be able to stop in that area, but it just transfers to a different vice.
Right.
Or they might have multiple issues. They may be struggling with alcohol, a series of infidelity that, some infidelity obviously isn't sexual addiction, but there's times that it is. And you just run until you deal with the root of it, or until that person is ready, willing, and able to deal with the root and the pain underneath. They're probably just going to stumble upon maybe a less harmful, but, still unhealthy coping mechanism or way of dealing with life.
Right. It's very true. Yeah. And we see that in the work that we've done, and it's so true. Yeah, where instead of healing that, they just go over and cross-addict or, use another way of coping with life. And so I'm just curious, what would you think is something that is really misunderstood about addiction? I know you kind of covered some of that, but is there anything else that you feel like is misunderstood about addiction that you think would be important for therapists and non-therapists to know?
Yeah, there's a piece, this piece about, that it's just a choice, or that it's a bad habit, or that it's a moral defect. Hopefully we've gotten past that, but I don't know that we always have. Like we mentioned, it might have just been what that person fell into, what they stumbled across that was the first time maybe they didn't feel horrible about themselves, or, they were able to not feel that horrible feeling, and so they kept doing it. But much like with self-injury, we try to help them to find healthier ways of coping, or an eating disorder or whatever, which isn't my specialty, of course, but, you try to help them deal with the underlying pain and find healthier ways of coping. That's a lot of what I try to do with addictions is, whatever it is, like I said, any substance or behavior, if it's a problem for them, it's a problem for them. So what can we do that's not a problem? What can we do that's a healthier way? What are some small ways that we can try to be healthier in your mind, body, and spirit? Because all of those work together, or they all work against each other. Mm-hmm. That connection is just there. And so, yeah, definitely there are those times that someone might need to have an additional treatment or focus or on, either inpatient or outpatient for the addiction issue. But if they're ready, willing, and able, we want to address the past trauma, mm-hmm. or the pain underneath, or sometimes even the ongoing trauma, because there's this idea of maybe the initial trauma that they got into, the addictive behavior, but then often through that addiction and that there's a lot of recklessness, and there's a lot of ongoing trauma. Yes. That there's just a lot to process through. And then if they're married and have kids, then there's a lot of those issues. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably more where I focus. And then if they need the additional treatment, addiction treatment, then I refer out for that.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense to me. And you're right. I think that a lot of people see it as being a choice, especially in, I feel like, the non-therapeutic or non-therapy population. Mm-hmm. A lot of my parents come in and are really angry at their teens for doing certain things, and they say things like, just stop, or right. Why can't they just do this or that, and not understanding that these behaviors are grounded in trauma, mm-hmm. and often these belief systems that are continuously being lived out in their life and potentially causing, like what you're saying, continuous trauma to even reinforce that, original trauma is to,
and that shame spiral mm-hmm. that just happens.
Yes. And so not understanding that lens that, we as therapists kind of get to see, it can be really difficult sometimes to,
because the fear is if we say it's not a choice, or that it's not wrong that they're going to be allowed to continue to do that. Well, no.
Right.
We,
right.
you know, we want to actually engage in treatment. We want to help them to heal. But it's just that change of lens.
Right.
That trying to help people get past that. And I think a lot of the science is helping us. Dr. Gabor Mate, who worked up in Canada, and has written several books. It's fascinating to kind of see some of the research that I saw him quoting, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me,
no,
but
it's totally fine.
Talking about, you know, just the different brain chemistry and how, you know, the opiate, you know, the opiates or the chemicals and that part of it, that has to do with the pleasure centers, and that dopamine can just have to do with desire. And so you can actually, addiction can be separated out. You could be addicted to something you don't even like.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how messed up is that?
Right.
But it's just sometimes how that trauma bond or how the brain chemicals work, and it can almost be more the rituals or the you know, the kind of the cycle of behavior leading up to the use or following the use could be just as addictive as the actual substance or behavior. So it's just amazing. The more that we're learning, the better I think we'll be able to help. And so I'm a big nerd, and I'm just always trying to study and learn and read. And when I'm driving, I've got Audible on. Like I just I just feel like there's so much out there. There's so much to learn.
Yes.
To be able to help and but it's just hard. The people are struggling so much, and they're fighting themselves because they themselves have taken on the idea that I'm bad.
Right.
And I wouldn't, if I could just stop these things, other people just stop these things. Other people don't get addicted. Well, yeah, other people have different brain chemistry. And other people could have tried the same things that you tried and not got addicted.
Right.
That's the danger of it, because we don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's so many different parts to it, like whether or not you have that genetic predisposition, whether or not you're in a certain situation, what, you know, resources or resilience resources you have. Like, you know, and again, I don't think people always, and they don't always understand the way their brain works when they're little too, because some of these things, you know, the trauma that they're working through now are things that happened when they had a little person brain, right? And the little person brain is not like an adult brain. And so we have to have empathy and grace for ourselves that we've created beliefs that we're probably still, you know, trying to reconfigure, and that are ingrained in our bodies that happened when we were little, and even sometimes in the womb, and even before that. Sometimes we're looking at the newest and latest in transgenerational trauma and how that shows up in our genes, which is really, I'm with you that, like, I like to see the science because I'm a very, like, in my head kind of person more naturally. And I feel like sometimes it's helpful to show people stuff instead of, like, being like, oh, we have this theory. Right. But to be able to tangibly say, okay, like,
because I'm a person who's like, okay, I don't want to hear your theories. Give me the research.
Show me how this works. And I mean, and sometimes that's actually to my detriment in ways, because I can be not as open-minded or see the truth because I'm so focused on seeing the tangibility of it. But yeah, I'm with you that I do like that. And I'm really excited that we live in an era where we're able to see a lot of that. And we still know so little, right? That's like the sad part, is like we still are learning so much. But I guess it's exciting too, because we get to see how that progresses. But yeah, we are lucky enough to be able to look at different things in the brain that have been, you know, theories for decades and maybe even hundreds of years, really.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot out there and a lot more. And, you know, we were talking about shame and the role that plays in addiction and in perfectionism. And like I said, I've been learning a lot from Dr. Gabor Mate and reading Brene Brown's work on shame resilience.
Yes, I love her.
Yeah.
I do. Everybody used to make fun of me in my cohort because I had a crush on Brene Brown. They'd be like, fangirl Jenny over here, always quoting Brene Brown, but I love her work.
Love
it.
If you're going to be a fangirl for somebody, she's a good one.
She's a good one. I'm with you.
So one of her quotes that just hit me, and I think I threw it up on Facebook, I just couldn't help myself, was when she said, wherever perfectionism is driving, shame is riding shotgun. Mm-hmm. And I was like, just like, amen, sister. Mm-hmm. Because it is. And I think that's probably true wherever addiction is driving, shame is riding shotgun. Mm-hmm. There's just so much that we're learning about shame, and how that's a kind of a relational emotion. Mm-hmm. And that's often, and Dr. Ariel Schwartz kind of talked about how that's often shame comes about as a positive emotion gets thwarted as you're reaching out to in love and connection, and that's rejected. All that shame response is just huge. And rather than guilt that says, I've done something wrong, mm-hmm. shame is I am wrong. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just to the core. And that's what I see so much in my people that have struggled with addiction, mm-hmm. Is there is that deep shame. And often we trace it back to 2 and 3 years old, when something happened, or, and often it wasn't even maybe something their parents intended, mm-hmm. but it just, trauma happens. Big trauma, little trauma. And sometimes little trauma continues to grow, or over time, it becomes complex and chronic. And Brene Brown, again, was like, the antidote to shame is empathy. And I was like, that's why therapy works, because for the first time maybe in their life, somebody comes in and says, and shows them empathy, mm-hmm. and says, yeah, maybe you did something bad, but you are not bad.
Yes. And I think the experience of them feeling like they can even share to somebody who is emotionally safe, or at least we mm-hmm. hope therapists are emotionally safe. Them even just experiencing somebody listening to them and hearing them and not being afraid of them, disgusted by them, reactive to them, mm-hmm. avoidant of them, to embrace, to be there with them, with all of their stuff, all their parts.
Yep.
So healing. I know, like, even in my own therapy journey, going back into when I was a teenager and, forced into it originally, I think that was a very surprising thing for me too, because I was like, I'm going to tell her some stuff and she's not going to be able to handle it, and I will get that, my brain was already in that narrative that, like, she's going to reject me, or like this will be too much or too whatever, right. And I'd share it and they were like, okay, tell me more, like, help me understand. Right. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, you actually are like, I can say these things and talk with you about it and have a conversation, and you don't see me as this horrible, icky person that, like, my shame is telling me I am,
Right.
And so, yeah, it can be such a healing experience. So you're talking about perfectionism and shame being related to addiction. Could you tell me more? Do you see more of a connection with perfectionism, or is it a little bit different? Like, do you notice a pattern of that with addiction, or what does that look like for you?
In the sense of, if you kind of tweak the definition of perfectionism to be kind of this all or nothing or black and white thinking, is very much addictive type thinking. When you dismiss all the positives and you only notice the flaw and you focus on that, that is very, very black and white, very, and that, yeah, very much goes in line with addiction. It's, I slipped up. Whether it's food, I had an Oreo, I might as well eat the whole box. Mm. Or if it's, I took a sip of that beer. I guess I might as well get plastered now. They do tend to coincide. And I, as a recovering perfectionist, kind of laugh because it was only after I was a therapist that I even realized that was not a good thing. I thought that being a perfectionist was what made me do so well, and how I got through school and how I got through grad school with not one, but 2 babies in the course of the program. It was only afterwards, when I was in private practice and I was, still building my caseload and had some time and was doing a lot of reading and I'm like, oh, there's some studies on perfectionism. Let me see what this says. And then was just blindsided when it's talking about it being a bad thing. And I'm like, what? What? This is my whole, how I cope with life. Okay, this is not good. Interesting. Let me see and I love research. So I'm like, all right, let me see what this says. And it's like, okay, so perfectionism, tends to go along with feelings of frustration. Check. Procrastination. Check. And feeling like a failure. Crap. Check for Lisa. And then going on to read, and it's talking about, perfectionism when it's paired with a need for approval is a recipe for depression. And I'm like, crap.
You're like, all of this is making a lot of sense.
This is making way more sense than I want it to right now. And so then kind of realizing, okay, if this is a bad thing, what do I do with that?
Yeah.
And really, that was kind of part of that time frame when I started doing my own work and kind of figuring out what did I need to let go of and what did I need to realize was mine, and how could I be my best self without beating myself up all the time.
Letting the perfectionism be the thing you feel that fuels it or drives you to be your best self, and it's
and realizing it wasn't that wasn't what made me best. That was what made me anxious and depressed.
Right. I definitely remember having my own experiences with like feeling like they were almost like the opposite and like or contradictory. I was like, no, this is what makes me good, and this is what makes me get stuff done, and this is what makes me this or that, or and if I give this up, am I just going to become this huge couch potato that doesn't do anything and is depressed, right? And like it was like such the opposite. Yes. And so it's been interesting in my own journey of like having to rewrite that story of my own, of trusting that I don't have to be super hard on myself to get stuff done. And I don't have to be perfect, and it's okay. Like the okayness of that, like has been like just a different experience for me. And even practicing like good enough, right? Like, and just because for me, I know that some of my hiccups are, even projects like this podcast, like it would be like, oh, I'm not going to take this on unless like I for sure I'm going to be able to do it in a way that like I'll release it on the same day every time and have great editing, and I'll only sound great all the time and never say which I never do. But there you go. And so it's like one of those things where I almost had to like give myself like a talk about it beforehand and reiterate like that's not the point of this. The point of this isn't for Jenny to be perfect and show how awesome she is. That is not the point of this. And to get out of my own way of doing work, like good work, and like sharing things and growing and experiencing things. But yeah, it's funny how like perfectionism like tells you you're going to do, like it's going to make you better, but really it gets in the way of you actually taking risks and doing things. Cause I would have like struggling with perfectionism. I never would have, put myself out there, vulnerability. Right. Ta-da. Right. Like I wouldn't be putting myself out there as much because of those fears and the pressure I put on myself.
Absolutely. And so that's been probably 10 years ago now, but I still laugh that I'm a recovering perfectionist, and every once in a while it kind of gets me, particularly when the stress comes along. Yes. And you start to feel a little insecure, and then then it comes back with like force. But being able to catch it and go, wait, no, what do I want to do? What's most important? And kind of just I don't know, trying to find that balance. And it's an ongoing, adjustment and journey, and just kind of, tweaking if I get a little bit too far one way or the other. But yeah, definitely a learning. And there's more research on it too. I mean, I was just reading something again the other day, and that might have been Dr. Ariel Schwartz was talking about, that perfectionism often comes from early childhood experiences of emotional abuse or neglect or trauma things. And it's, this idea that the kids don't stop loving their caregivers, they stop loving themselves when they're abused. Or feeling like, it's not that mommy's bad, I'm bad.
Right.
Or whoever that, that abuse or neglect, wherever that's coming from, they take it on the self because, somehow we feel like we can control that. Even our subconscious, that I can't change them, but if I was just better, if I didn't make any mistakes, there would be nothing for them to criticize. Well, that's not how abuse works.
Right. No, it doesn't work that way.
Or even with, the bullies in school, or kids are just, even if it's not full on bullying, but kids just kind of pick on each other. And you're either, you're too short, you're too tall, you're too thin, you're too fat, you're too dumb, you're too smart. It's just,
that.
It doesn't matter. There's, and it's kind of, and it's, I think, worse for some of those kids who've been through some emotional abuse or trauma, because, we know their attachment is struggling, most likely, if it was in that, the parental relationship. And, you read about attachment, and it's talking about, with some of that insecure attachment, you kind of wince at the world, and the world winces back. And that's probably Siegel. I'm bad about quoting things, and I'm not sure exactly where I got it, but
it's still really important to talk about.
But it was just realizing, that explains a lot of middle school crap. Like, I didn't like me or know me, so how could anyone else like me or know me?
Right. Or even, I still see that in my adult clients that are struggling with dating, but their viewpoint, they're like so scared of themselves and they're already rejecting themselves before they put themselves out there. And so they don't even realize that the energy they're even sending off or the way that they behave is telling people, don't enter, don't come here.
So that secondary attachment is, struggling as well.
Yes.
As an adult.
Yes. And, I will say for my own journey in perfectionism, I had a period of time where, I felt like I was very successful at being perfect, and that was, the start of my eating disorder. And, the sad part is it actually did what I wanted it to do in a way, because I was trying to protect myself from criticism. I was trying to protect myself from shame. And as I made myself smaller in so many different ways, figuratively and physically. And I never complained, and I never, I made A's, and I attended everything with my church, and I was, perfect, quote unquote. Right. I have air quotes right now. I didn't get as much grief. And, and it was weird because at the time that had that reinforced my perfectionism and shame and everything I was doing. So I actually was I'm nailing this. But what I didn't realize over time was I completely lost me. I no longer had a voice. I no longer knew what I even liked. I no longer felt like I could. I felt like I was apologizing for my existence in a way, and part of that was the figurative, losing myself, right? And that stemmed from my own trauma, belief system, shame, all that stuff. But yeah, I think the tricky part is it can be seductive in the way that for some people it works for a little while, and it helps, and the ways they're trying to have it help, but in the end they're actually losing themselves and hurting themselves. And
Jenny, I could argue that with any addiction.
Yeah.
Why would they do it twice if it wasn't effective the first time?
Right.
It's because it was effective, even if
it did work. Yeah. And I don't think people understand that either, right? That haven't maybe struggled with that specific addiction. I hear people talk about, why would they do that? Or self-harm. I hear a lot of that from parents. Why would they do that? And I'm there's something about it that is helpful, protective, useful. It's not like they just woke up one day, and they're hey, I'm just going to decide to cut myself today. That's
because you sure wouldn't do it twice if there wasn't a benefit.
That's true. That's true. Probably, I mean, it's funny because, like, it's not like this is a big deal or anything, but I remember trying cigarettes, like, for, like, a week or two, and, like, totally, it just, for whatever reason for me, did not fit. Like, I just felt really silly, and, like, I could see how, like, if I were in a predisposition and, like, had all the stars aligned or whatever, like, I could still be smoking cigarettes, but luckily, like, for whatever reason, it didn't do anything for me.
Right.
You know, and I think that that's, if we were able to know that, like, any person is vulnerable to that sort of thing. It's not like, it's not people that are unintelligent. It's not people that are impoverished. It's not people that don't have self-control or morals.
No more than depression or anxiety. You know, it doesn't know race, class, or creed. True. You know, it hits us just the same. And, you know, like I said, probably as I worked with clients that were struggling, I can think of a client, severe case, that had struggled with meth and other things. At one point was even dealing, kind of lucky to be alive. He even would talk about how it was surprised him how much brain function he had for all the drugs that he had done in his life. And you know, and one, because he had struggled for so long, and you know, it was one of those things that not a lot of people wanted to work with him, but I was just intrigued. And, you know, as I got to know him and he got to trust me and actually be honest with me about his story, you know, it goes back to a horrible poverty, a variety of factors, but horrible poverty and issues with the family. But when he was 5 years old, he was out mowing the grass. So let's think about that for a minute. A 5-year-old running the lawnmower. But something wasn't working right, and so he took off the gas tank, and he accidentally huffed the gas. And I think it knocked him out. But what he remembers when he woke up is that was the first time he found something that numbed him out. And so he and I had this whole conversation, because he was like, what kind of a horrible person, you know, starts huffing gas at 5? And I'm like, what's going on in a 5-year-old's life that you would do it once, but repeatedly, right? Like the first time was an accident, but you needed to numb out your life so bad that you would huff gasoline as a 5-year-old little boy out cutting grass, you know? And so it just kind of flipped the script for me around addictions and realizing these are hurting people, hurting little boys and girls that grew up knowing no different. And everyone has told them they're bad and they believe it. Right.
Yeah. And I think it can also be hard, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but sometimes I'll get families in the room or people have the story that, you know, my childhood was perfect and we never wanted for anything, and you know,
that's the client saying that.
I shouldn't.
Liar.
No, I know. I know that and there's that intergenerational transmission of trauma and the stuff that, I mean, I think a lot of people have that misconception that, you know, in some cases it's very what I would call more identifiable trauma, but then there's a lot of invisible trauma that we don't really talk about as a culture. And so they're like, well, I was fed, my parents didn't hit me, like blah blah blah, like I shouldn't be, the should word, right, the shame, right. I shouldn't be depressed, I shouldn't be struggling with the things that I do. It's, again, going into that shame identity, it's me, it's not, you know, but as you unravel it, I mean, as we work with
and hopefully
clients,
that person's willing to unravel that over time. But if they can't go there, they may not be ready.
Well, and it also, with one system, it was really interesting because it almost seemed to be like if they were to admit that stuff, it would be disloyalty to their family, right?
Oh, 100%.
And their family was very defensive and like, we didn't do anything wrong. And, you know, it's very interesting to see those dynamics play out.
Shame and secrecy drive addictions.
Yes. What's not talked about.
Yeah. All those unspoken rules. So even if it wasn't overt abuse or trauma, there was this sense of, that these rules around don't need anything, or don't tell, that they had to be perfect maybe, or that there was an illusion they had to live up to, that they couldn't.
Yeah.
And then they stumbled upon something that helped them feel better.
Yes.
Temporarily, and they kept doing it.
Yep.
Until it destroyed their life.
Yes. No, I appreciate that we're talking about all these things, but because there's so many different ways and avenues and ways that this looks, right? That this could happen. And I think that it's so important that we are, as clinicians and humans, open-minded to understanding that addiction can really happen to any person. And, in different ways, we were kind of talking about this earlier, we all have our stuff that we're recovering from.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I think it's so important to kind of show the different ways that are maybe stories that people don't hear because they're not always, they don't have the same exposure to addiction as other people might have.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm going to move along into our last 4.
Okay.
And the first question is, what is the thing you wish you knew when you first started?
I would say probably, and they might do it differently now. I wish there would have been probably more encouragement to do your work. Like, if you've never been in therapy, go be in therapy, because all of us have our issues. And I remember Brenda Harvey Smith, she was one of my teachers and she was my post-grad soup. She would say, nobody gets through childhood without baggage. If it's not your parents, it's the bullies at school. And there's a lot of truth to that. Even if you only went for a few sessions, we all have stuff that we need to work on. And it's hard to go to the depths with the client if you are too afraid to go to your own depths.
Amen to that.
Yeah. And I've learned that probably, I had to, shortly after, a couple years after school, started doing my own work, had never done it before, and have continued on and off over the years, and have no shame about it anymore. I'm like, mental health is just as important as physical. If I don't apologize for going to the doctor or taking my kid to the doctor, I'm not going to apologize about going to therapy.
No, not at all. And I think it's practicing what we preach, right? I think it honestly builds rapport with people for them to know, like, you actually do work too. You're actually still, because we will never arrive. We don't arrive and then we're done with our work. Like, we're constantly growing as humans. And, you mentioned earlier, like, when you get stressed out, you'll tend to go into certain spaces.
Yeah, we fall back into.
And, we all have the stress threshold. And so it's important that we're able to know ourselves and our patterns. Like, I have patterns too that perfectionism is one of them, that I fall into when I'm stressed as well, and I reach that threshold. And so you're right, we absolutely have to continuously do our own work
and keep doing our own work. It's part of our own healing and part of being able to walk with people on their journey.
Absolutely. So what would be a psychology or therapy book that you would recommend to therapists or non-therapists?
Oh, man.
Or you could have 2 different ones. Sometimes people have 2 different ones. Like, this is for therapists, this is for...
I'm just a huge fan of reading and getting more information. And so I guess I would recommend whatever area you're in. If couples is what you want to learn more about, my go-to is Gottman. I love his work. Of course, he's got all the research to back it up, right?
That's true.
But when we're talking about raising kids, I really appreciate The Whole Brain Child and Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson. And God, there's so much out there. And we're at a time in history where, you can get books on Audible, or you can, listen to TED Talks or hear different podcasts. And I just feel like the more that we know, the better off we are going to be as individuals and to be able to help. Certainly, we want to pay attention to who we're listening to. Do they, what's their background? Do they know their stuff?
Right.
I'm not talking about Dr. Phil. Sorry to anybody who loves Dr. Phil, but
He's got a doctor by his name, but that is not.
Oh man, don't get me started. But yeah, I mean, God, Brene Brown's work. We've talked about Dan Siegel's, John Gottman. Their institute is still, putting out together so many incredible programs, and so yeah, pay attention to the research, but some of those authors, you can't go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great names. And then do you have a quote or words that resonate for you or meaningful for you? Or I say favorite quote, but I feel like sometimes that puts a little too much pressure on it, because I'm sure there's a lot of different things that you're like, this is a great quote. But is there anything that's been on your heart and mind lately?
Well, I quoted Brene earlier. So, honestly, though, what really has hit me, not just in couples work, is, and I think it's in his 7 Principles book, John Gottman just makes a brief statement, but it's so profound. It's like, if a person feels misunderstood, disliked, or unappreciated, they are incapable of change. And I think about that with husband and wives, who are so much trying to change each other, at least before they come in the office.
Yes. Yeah,
or parents and kids, or even from therapist to client, or when I, used to supervise case managers, it was, and obviously they were at a different education level, but it's like, if you don't like them, you can't help them, yes. And I think about that in my own marriage, if I don't feel understood and appreciated and liked, it's hard to take down the armor and be vulnerable and be, creative in our problem solving. And so, yeah, I can't go wrong with Gottman.
So good. That's great. I even, I don't know if Dr. Rathbun said this during your time at Friends, but he has this quote that's like, if you can't find one thing that you don't like about your client, you shouldn't be seeing them.
If you can't find one thing that you like.
You can't find one thing, right? And it's
he
just
did tell us that.
Yeah, and it's important that you at least find one thing, and that's resonated for me. I don't know. I feel like I tend to usually find things I like about people, but every now and then I struggle with that too. But that resonated for me as like one of those things, like you've got to be able to like the people that you're working with and find something,
because they'll feel it if you don't.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we have that we feel that energy and that trust, and I know there's so much of that is just kind of, I don't know, it's on a physical level, like on a energy level of some kind. Right,
that we can't even, put language to. You just feel it. That's true. And usually that's where our self-therapist comes in, and we got to be like, where is my stuff coming up? Where I'm like, feeling like I don't want to, work with this client, or resistance or whatever is going on with my own stuff. So true. And, my last question is, what's the question that I didn't ask that you feel like would be important that we covered, or something I might have missed? Because I don't always know all the right questions to ask,
Sure. So one thing that did kind of come to mind, and we alluded to this a little bit earlier, maybe before we started recording, was just we talk so much about the mind and body connection, but for me, the missing link in so many ways is that mind, body, spirit, and that the role of spirituality in treatment. And that's maybe kind of a tricky thing, but if I take it down to its basics, we got to ask those existential questions of, where's this person at? What do they believe about life and death? And what do they believe about life after death, or purpose and meaning? That is a spirituality. Take religion out of it. It's, what do we do with that madness in our soul? Because life is hard.
Yeah.
And sometimes, sometimes marriage feels harder because you're doing life together. Maybe that's why we have a job. I don't know. But and it was, again, back at Friends. It's I remember talking, and I think it was Duke University that had done some research and found that the number one factor in health and long life was a spiritual awareness. And so that kind of opened a door for me to go, okay, even in a secular setting, even in community mental health, I got to ask people about spirituality. Because whether we directly acknowledge it or not, it matters. And sometimes it affects us more when we don't acknowledge it, because that's maybe the deeper pain or the deeper anxiety is those sacred or existential things that they're not dealing with or not coping with or, struggling to make sense of in their lives. Right. And so that's maybe part of what also drew me to where I'm at now at Catholic Charities. Obviously, you don't have to be Catholic to work there or even to be a client. But a lot of people are coming there because they're wanting that faith base. And so for me, it's been a really beautiful year of bringing the best of science and the best of faith into the same room. And I don't know, the nerd in me gets a little giddy when it's like something in science proves something that something we knew to be true and from a faith perspective.
Yes, something we had faith in.
And I just remember, well, truth is truth. And sometimes science has to catch up to actually prove it.
Well,
right. Right.
And even that spirituality, like sometimes I even see that as like, or part of that being the space to hold questions, right? And to be able to believe in things, right, that we don't see, because, we're never going to know the full 100% truth. Like that's just not, at least I don't believe that's part of our experience. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that
this
science
side of heaven.
I was about to say, I don't think science is going to be able to show us everything it is that we need to know, but to have space for question marks, to have space for faith, and that's part of our work too, right? Because there are times where it's like, okay, we're not able to pinpoint this trauma for a person or pinpoint all the things or make all of the context make sense, but we still know there's this thing there and this pull or this push, and sometimes it's like being able to let that be a question mark and understand the spiritual significance of it.
Or even just having hope in the beginning when they feel like they have no hope. I mean, there's a spiritual aspect of that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. I'm so glad that we were able to talk, because I feel like there were so many things you said that I'm like, I feel like I learned from you. I feel like I was able to say,
that.
Amen. And
we did a couple times, didn't we?
Yeah. So it was really neat to have that conversation, because we haven't had a conversation before this. So it's really great to get to know you and other people in our community who are doing similar good work and are passionate about ongoing learning.
There's a lot of good things happening here in Wichita.
Yes, we just need to connect and learn more from each other, because that's the point of this, is how can we connect and reach and get to know each other a bit better. So cool. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for your time.